later on. The Commission worried that UAE was not defining expiration dates or an expiration mechanism for exemptions. And so in that respect, the draft and ultimately the current version look more like RoHS 1 than RoHS 2 in terms of that whole exemption management approach. So they raised that issue to UAE. The draft also talked about a conformity assessment system, but really gave no detail or input on what it was going to be like or what it would consist of. Excuse me, and the numbering and content of the exemptions were not exactly consistent with EU numbering. So those were some of the early issues. The current regulation is interesting. It's in Arabic. However, most of the annexes are in English, and you can tell exactly where they're taken out of. Annex 1, in this case, is the product categories. And similar to EU RoHS, I think it's Article 1, defines product the same way essentially as EU RoHS defines EEE, electrical and electronic equipment. Dependent on electricity or electromagnetic fields, voltage ratings not exceeding 1000 volts DC and 1500 volts AC. Now, Annex 1, as I said, defines the same RoHS product categories in English, and as you can see from the example here, this was lifted right from the WE directive, this Annex 2 of the WE directive. They basically just copied and pasted it here, which is interesting. It says that not only are the categories in UAE RoHS the same as EU RoHS, but the examples are the same. Therefore, I think the implication is that they want the scope to be precisely the same as EU RoHS. The same restricted substances and the same concentration limits are defined as well in Annex 2, and you can see here the addition of the 4 phthalates that come into force in 2 years in EU RoHS. Now, Annex 3 is a list of exemptions for categories 1 through 7, 10, and 11. The same as Annex 3 from EU RoHS. The actual EU RoHS Annex 3 exemptions I've mapped to just this first page of UAE RoHS exemptions. And you can see it's generally consistent. However, they've included 7B. So if you have a bunch of network infrastructure or server equipment that has 7B related lead and solder, and you don't have a market for it, well, you just might have a market for it here in the UAE. So they didn't catch that one. And generally, it's consistent with what is current in the EU exemption list. Now, Annex 4 is again parallel to the Annex 4 of EU RoHS. Annex 4 of EU RoHS are the exemptions that apply to category 8 and 9 product only, medical devices and monitoring and control equipment. And again, you can see that these exemption numbers are not the same as the EU. So that was one thing that the EU requested they do, is to be consistent in numbering. They didn't do that. Almost nobody is doing that. Though, so the UAE is not exactly alone in this. Now, one issue that Annex 4 has is a whole bunch of typos, which is interesting because the draft regulation was did not have these typos. They must have recreated all these annexes from rather than just copy and use the draft language. In addition, there are some typos that are actually rather critical and quite curious, because if you say you're using exemption 30, that doesn't make any sense. And if you say you're using exemption 31, that by itself doesn't make any sense either. What are solders on printed circuit boards exempt from? So I think their layout here is still problematic. Same with exemption 34. So how they're going to deal with this, I honestly do not know, but we've raised the fact to them. Article 1 of the law contains some definitions, and they're all the definitions you would expect. As I said before, the term product is the same as EEE. Defines other critical things. Contains some additional definitions. Why they're placed in an annex, I don't know, but they were there in the draft as well. Non-road mobile machines, large-scale stationary industrial tools, large-scale fixed installations are defined in Annex 5, but they're not mentioned in the regulation as being out of scope. So there's an issue here with the definition of scope in UAE RoHS. Are these actually out of scope, or are they in scope? Why are they defined here and not referenced in the language of the regulation itself? Again, unclear. You'll see here also there are definitions for cables, definition of homogeneous materials, and definitions of spare parts. We will talk about those. Those are actually referenced in the regulation. Now, one of the more important issues here is how they're is the fact that the scope exclusions and substance exemption language and concepts are mixed up. I see this a lot in general. I try to correct people when they ask if their product is exempt. Well, it's excluded from scope. It's not exempt. Exemptions are for substances and applications of substances in products that are within scope. But nevertheless, this scope definition in Article 2 of the regulation is problematic. It says the provisions of this decision shall apply to all products as listed in Annex 1, which you saw, attached to this decision. Products of any use as determined in Annexes 3 and 4 attached to this decision are excluded from scope. So, Annex 3 and 4 are exemptions, which I showed you. That's why I showed those to you before I got to this point. This is to set you up for this. Those are substance application dependent. They are exemptions from the restrictions of the substances. Excluded from scope I believe is incorrect. They probably mean exempt from substance restriction limits per the specific exemption. However, and again, this language is very similar to the language in the draft. So I don't think this is a translation artifact. The problem with this statement is that nearly all products, nearly all EEE, uses one or more exemptions. Therefore, if you read this literally, and it's hard to do that because it's hard to interpret it precisely, but if you interpret it literally, it means that, to me anyway, all products that are using an exemption are excluded from the scope of the regulation. Therefore, the regulation is effectively dead in the water. There's no application to it. So I think this is a pretty critical thing that needs to be clarified. I'm quite surprised that it reads like this, because I don't believe that's their intent to put out a regulation and say everything is excluded from the scope of this regulation. Maybe a UAE legal scholar can interpret this if they have the proper expertise, but it certainly is is problematic. And again, the EU noted this issue twice in their comments on drafts, and it's still not corrected. So maybe if if you get caught with this law and your products get taken off the market, you can refer to this scope statement and say, but I don't think that's their intent. The concentration limits, as I said, are the same position and showed are the same percentages as EU RoHS. Homogeneous materials as defined in Annex 5 is the same as EU RoHS, but the regulations reference in Article 3 technical requirements is curious. The homogeneous materials concentration rates shall be calculated in ratio to the weight of the materials incorporated in the part where such materials were used. While this probably says the same thing as the EU RoHS directive in terms of defining how to interpret homogeneous materials, the draft actually said it much better. I don't have that language here and I don't have it in front of me, but I was curious that they changed that. The compliance dates are defined in two different annexes. I think it's 7 and 8 to the regulation. I've created a somewhat simplified table here to describe them. There are 4 groups of products. I've put the RoHS equivalent category next to those groups, A, B, C, and D. The first group, A, is categories 8 and 9. The medical devices and monitoring and control instruments. The restrictions come into force for the first 6 RoHS substances in January of 2020. 2 years later, the phthalates become restricted. Now, cables and spare parts for Group A placed on the market, and the term of the use of that term placed on the market here is very interesting as well, as it is a term that is defined in directive, and it is also not defined here. So that is perhaps an area that needs to be clarified a bit. Cables and spare parts are come into scope for all 10 substances in January 2022 for categories 8 and 9. Now, what's interesting about this is that spare parts must comply. And it seems the spare parts, by being called a product here, even though they're not a product as listed in Annex 1, do they have to go through the same conformity assessment and so on? That's another thing that's unclear here. Group C, the RoHS equivalent categories are the original RoHS categories 1 through 7 and 10. And all the products in this category, cables and spare parts for repair, come into force next January. So this is the group that is under the gun right now. You've got about 5 months to get ready for this. 4 months even. Well, 5. And the phthalates become restricted 2 years later in January 2020. Group D is category 11, which is everything else, and that all comes into scope in 2020. Supplier responsibilities are somewhat defined. They state that you have to register per the ECAS requirements. ECAS is, as I said before, the Emirates Conformity Assessment System, and access to this is on the ESMA portal. You can apply for all kinds of services, like ECAS certification. This system has not been updated in 2 years, it appears. The last date on the web pages for update was 2015. And there's no mention of this regulation in any of the pages that I was able to get access to. So it's unclear they've actually incorporated this yet, this regulation. Hopefully they're working on it, because one of the requirements is to complete this compliance verification form A, which is presumably on the portal. There is no indication of what this form looks like, what it contains, or anything else. It appears that data submission is all electronic through this portal. That was one of the questions we received. How is data to be submitted? The best way is probably to zip up a technical file and ship it through this portal. But again, that's unclear right now. The portal has not been updated to address this regulation. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. Demonstrating compliance, Annex 6 contains a list of standards related to demonstrating compliance. As you can see on the right, we have 62321, although it's a down-rev version of that. 62321 has been split into a series of sub-standards, each dealing with a different aspect of a different substance. 62474, that is the current version. TC111 and IEC is pretty close, probably a year away from issuing an update to that. So that's the current version. 62476, I'm not sure that anybody actually uses that. And 50581, which is the harmonized standard for EU RoHS. Now, the implication is that data collected for EU RoHS, whether test per IEC 62321 or risk-based per 50581, which can include test, of course, is acceptable. However, I would have rather seen them reference IEC 63000 rather than EN 50581, because EN 50581 is an EU specific standard. That's a Senelec standard. It's owned by Senelec. Nobody else has any input to it. At least the IEC standard is international, and that was its intent when TC111 created it and released it, is if other regulators around the world wanted to harmonize with EU RoHS, they can reference the international version of 50581, which is 63000. It's essentially the same regulation, or same standard rather, and just internationalized and agreed to by IEC technical committees around the world. Conformity assessment. This is where all the questions, well, not all of them, but a lot of questions are around. You must provide, and again, presumably via the ECAS portal. It's not specific about that, but when you look at the ECAS portal, it's pretty clear this is where you're supposed to provide the information they're asking for. A general description of the product, a detailed description of the product or product line, including a list of substances and materials used in the manufacturing process. This particular line, I have two things to point out. Product line. The implication here is that you can apply a conformity assessment to more than just a specific product. You can apply it to a broader product line. And in fact, as we'll see later, you can actually apply it to all similar products, I'll say, coming out of a single factory. So that was another question. Can we do product lines, or do we have to submit a separate assessment request for each product? You could do it once for a product line and maybe once for everything. The including a list of substances and materials used in the manufacturing process is rather curious, though. That's not very clear. Why do they need all materials used in the manufacturing process? Are they looking for fluxes and solvents and even reactive resins and things that are back further in the product line or product manufacturing process? That's unclear, especially for a regulation that affects only 10 substances or substance categories, considering that products contain thousands of substances and are manufactured with probably hundreds or thousands more. Asking for a list of substances and materials used in the manufacturing process, if I take that literally, is simply not going to happen. The list of standards used, so you can see they've kind of taken this from the technical file requirements for Module A requirements for EU RoHS. List of standards used, inspection and testing reports, accepted and approved by the authority. This may be a bit of a holdover from safety testing, which does have a conformity assessment, third-party test requirement, as do most safety, not all, but most safety testing around the world. But it doesn't appear to be related to this. Yes, you can include inspection and testing reports, but why do they have to be approved, accepted and approved by the authority already? So again, another point that's unclear. Documentation of part material compliance showing the rates of hazardous material is used in the product. I take that to mean show the exemptions taken. And you should be getting that information anyway. And do that per compliance verification form A, whatever that is. And provide whatever else they ask for. Now, language requirements, this is another question. These are unclear. Is English acceptable? Are other languages acceptable? So again, as I said, the draft was issued in English. The language of the current regulation is Arabic. The portal itself is available in both Arabic and English, but no other language. So they have not defined in this regulation what the language of the materials that you must provide them should be in. Now, the website says that they will respond within 8 working days to submissions. It's unclear if that's just an acknowledgement or if that's an acceptance. I believe it's probably just an acknowledgement. A question on a lot of people's minds is whether or not we have to mark. A certificate of compliance is required before selling product in the UAE. And the ECAS system says there's a 30 working day service time to obtain an Emirates quality mark, which is this this fancy mark down here that I'm showing. That appears to generally be a voluntary mark. There is no mention of a required mark in the regulation. So I do not believe there's a mark requirement, but I'm not positive. And if there was a mark requirement, this would be the mark. And no, I don't have any information about the color scheme of the mark, the size of the mark, or anything like that. Now, there is a general requirements for ECAS document that has some information that is useful to understanding general conformity assessment requirements. So I've put some of those here on this slide. When the results of the conformity assessment demonstrate that the relevant requirements are met, ESMA shall issue an ECAS registration certificate to the product. This means the product is registered, and that's an approval. It can be used by the trader in marketing their product. The certificate is not transferable and is valid only for the product being evaluated and manufactured in a particular facility. So if you have multiple products or multiple facilities manufacturing a given product, you have to presumably submit a different registration for each facility. The registration certificate shall be valid for 1 year subject to renewal. Again, that one's unclear. Do we have to renew this registration certificate on an annual basis for every registered product or product line? And this is the sentence that makes me think that product line or broader is acceptable to be applied for under a single conformity assessment. 8.1 is a registered supplier, and you do have to register on the ECAS system, and there's a whole bunch of other issues with that. Registered supplier can extend the registration to other types or models of products made in the same factory to the same technical regulation. In cases like this, ESMA shall decide a product shall undergo conformity assessment or is waived for a particular model. So since everything you're making, presumably, that you're going to be selling in UAE is going to be produced to the requirements of this regulation, presumably you should need, if you have a single, quote, factory, unquote, you should only have to apply for one registration certificate for your entire product line. We'll see if that's actually the case. So there are a whole bunch of outstanding questions. Here's just a few of them. Where can we obtain Form A and what does it contain? Is annual submission required since ECAS certificate is only good for 1 year? Is English acceptable for any aspect of the provided documentation or any other non-Arabic language? Will technical documentation collected for the EU RoHS suffice? I believe it will, but I'm not sure about that. Will ESMA be able to handle the application load without undue delay? If everybody tries to comply comply before the January 1st deadline for categories 1 through 7 and 10, this could be an enormous volume of applications. So, are they going to break under the pressure? It's going to be something to see. Will general requirements for ECAS and everything else be updated for this regulation? None of the documentation surrounding ECAS nor the system itself reflect the existence of this regulation right now. And do spares for pre-regulation products, i.e. non-compliant products, have to be compliant, i.e. anything that is in operation today or is placed on the market prior to January 1st, 2018, or any of the other enforced dates, do those spares have to comply with the regulation? Or since they're for a product that doesn't necessarily comply, do they have to comply? And if so, how? And we know from all the efforts with the European Union over the last decade, it took several years to really get that clarified for how it was going to be addressed in RoHS 2, and we came to I think a good ending on that. It could have been very complex, but this will be an interesting area here. None of this is free. There are fees. Here's what the fees are from the website. Application for registration is 600 Emirati dirham. I'm probably pronouncing that terribly wrong. And as of this weekend, I've given some of the rates here for conversion. That 600 AED is $163 in US and 142.5 euros. So there's also a fee for issuance of the conformity certificate. There is a document review fee. I'm not sure what that's for. Hopefully it's not for the review of your technical documentation. Yeah, there's probably a wide variety of there are a wide variety of things the ECAS system does. So I'm hopeful that not all of this applies to this particular aspect. So other important sections of the regulation, there is Article 6, market surveillance and control. Product for sale or display must comply with the requirements. Authorities may take samples of products to review for compliance. There are possible actions for non-compliant product, which are what you would expect: withdrawal from the market, cancellation of compliance certificate, and, quote, other measures, unquote. Furthermore, suppliers will be liable for costs. There are penalties, and then if you disagree with the penalties, there is a grievance procedure. So I haven't gone into detail about that because that seemed to be less important right now. Here are the resources, the web pages, and when you get this draft with this, I'm sorry, this isn't a draft, this presentation, you can just click on them and go see them. And you can see here the last one, general requirements for ECAS. As I said before, this has not been updated to reflect the UAE RoHS process. So very interesting, but we've got an issue. So what to do now? Right now, I would, if you're selling product in the UAE, talk to your people over there and work with them perhaps to try to put pressure on ESMA to get clarification on some of these requirements, because there's a very short time. I feel like we're we're reliving China Ross here back in early 2007, where the FAQ was tremendously unclear, and they clarified it a couple of weeks before or 1 week before the rule came into force. Register on the ECAS portal if you can. I was unable to register on it. There were a couple of issues for various countries. It only gives you specific cities that you can register against. In the US, it was only New York and Washington, D.C. China didn't even have any cities listed. In Italy, it was only Rome. So I'm not sure what that is, but it's a mandatory question. It's also, you're supposed to put in your phone number so it can send a validation code to that phone number and you can proceed. This is what really stopped me. It doesn't send the validation code text to my US phone number, and I had looked it up, properly preceded it with 001, so I think I did it right. I asked them about that. I've not gotten a response. Time is short, and ESMA approval is likely to be a bottleneck, as I said, so get moving. There's a lot for us to know about this, and I think we should all be quite concerned. So thank you for your attention. This is a very old picture of San Francisco. Our skyline looks quite different. I think I'm going to have to update this picture for the future. That's it, and thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks so much, Mike. Mike, if you could pass control back there it's back. I can just see this. The screen has come up there now. Thanks so much, Mike, for today's presentation, and thank you all for joining us. Do watch out for the webinar materials that will be sent out in the coming days, and also do get in touch if you would like to avail of our translation offer. The email address is translations@complianceandrisks.com. Okay, so that concludes today's presentation, everyone. Do get in touch if you have any questions in relation to the materials today. Until the next time, take care and goodbye for now.